Welcome. Today we're going to talk about the Spanish-American War. We're calling this part 2 because we already looked at the causes of the Spanish-American War. We looked at yellow journalism. Now we're going to focus on the actual fighting, the actual battles of the Spanish-American War. So our goals for today: to explain the battles and strategy used in the Spanish-American War, to describe the role of the Rough Riders and the Buffalo Soldiers in the Spanish-American War, and to describe the terms of the Treaty of Paris. So if we look at the Spanish-American War, the war, even though it began over Cuba, it really started with the war in the Philippines. So the first battle was not fought in Cuba. It was fought on May 1st, 1898 in the Philippines. Why? Because the Philippines were a Spanish colony. They were a colony of Spain. And as a result of that, America really wasn't that interested in Cuba. Sure, we wanted some influence, but what we were really interested in was the Philippines. We wanted the Philippines as a military base. We wanted the Philippines to sell our goods to, and so we would actually start the war over there because that was more of a priority for us. Not because it actually would have an impact on Cuban independence or freedom, but because we're just using this as an excuse to go to war with Spain. So the first battle was fought May 1st, 1898. Commodore George Dewey landed with his most experienced fleet. He took the best troops with him to go fight in the Philippines. The people who will later fight in Cuba, they're sort of all left behind. So the most experienced fleet goes to the Philippines. They go to fight in Manila Bay. And at the time, most of the local Filipinos actually support the United States. Why? Because we're technically, at least we tell them, we're there to try to help them fight for their independence. And it turns out that it's going to be an overwhelming success between the force of the Filipino people, and especially with the might and power of the United States. In August of 1898, Spain surrenders, and they give up the Philippines. So this is a huge victory. The results are maybe going to surprise the Filipinos, but this is a huge victory for the United States. Next, the war in Cuba. So after we send all our top-notch troops, all our crack troops to go fight in the Philippines, we send all the leftovers to fight in the Caribbean. So there are about 17,000 U.S. troops that will do the fighting, and most of these are the unexperienced troops. These are the new recruits, or at least some of the lesser experienced fighting troops, and they didn't really have the supplies that they needed. They didn't have the weapons. They didn't have the right type of clothing for the climate. This is going to be all around a disaster even to begin with. Now, the one bright side, or at least so we hear is the bright side, is a group of people put together by Teddy Roosevelt known as the Rough Riders. They were a volunteer cavalry. That means they rode in on horses. Basically, these were a bunch of rich men who had nothing better to do with their time. They were all experienced with riding horses because that's what rich people did. They were also experienced with shooting guns because that's what rich people did. They rode horses and shot guns, and that was what life was like for most rich people. So Teddy Roosevelt gets a group of people known as the Rough Riders put together, and they basically start to fight a number of battles, including the Battle of San Juan Hill, or Kettle Hill, if you will. And they get a whole lot of credit for the victory. In fact, onto the Spanish-American War today, we would have you believe that without Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, there's no way America would have won the Spanish-American War. This couldn't be further from the truth. Now, they did play sort of an important role. I mean, that's not to say that they were useless, but they get way, way, way more credit for the victory than they actually do for the work they put in. Why? Oh yeah, you guessed it. We talked about it before. Yellow journalism. So Teddy Roosevelt is really good at advocating for himself. He gets the newspapers to report on what a hero he is, and so he comes back getting much of the credit, even if he really didn't do all that much stuff. So thank you, yellow journalism. Not only did yellow journalism start the war, but it will give Teddy Roosevelt a whole lot of credit. Yes, the Buffalo Soldiers. Those are the people who didn't get a lot of credit in the Spanish-American War. Buffalo Soldiers. Buffalo Soldiers were African Americans who were part of the United States military at the time. They weren't allowed to serve in the same ranks as white people were, but Buffalo Soldiers played a huge, huge, huge role in the victory in the Spanish-American War. Unfortunately, they don't get a lot of credit for it because they didn't have the same press. They didn't have the yellow journalism exaggerating the role of what they did. In fact, most people were ignoring the role they did, but without African Americans, without the Buffalo Soldiers, there's a pretty good chance that America wouldn't have won the battles in Cuba. These were really the men that knew the lay of the land. They knew the climate, they knew the temperature, they knew what they were doing down there, and they got the job done. So when we start to fight against Cuba, the goal is to blockade the Spanish in Cuba. So what we want to do is we want to blockade. We want to keep the Spanish ships from leaving the Bay of Santiago. And so we figure if we can surround them, if we can surround their ships, then we can sink them, we can take them over, we'll get them to surrender. And that is exactly the strategy that gets played out. So once we surround them, we then have to attack the troops that are actually there. And this is where the Battle of Kettle Hill and the Battle of San Juan Hill take place. The Battle of Kettle Hill, which is sometimes called the Battle of San Juan Hill, but actually takes place on Kettle Hill, and San Juan Hill was a lesser important battle. Basically, America is going on an upward charge. The Spanish have the high ground, and this is a victory that it seems like America should lose under all circumstances. Anytime somebody has the high ground, they've got the better chance at winning a battle. But not this time. The United States troops, with some of the credit from the Rough Riders, they will charge up Kettle Hill. The Rough Riders will lead to a distraction up Kettle Hill, and then they'll eventually go up the main hill on up San Juan Hill, and they will eventually end up defeating the Spanish. So most of the Rough Riders action was actually seen on Kettle Hill, not San Juan Hill, but they get a whole lot of credit for what they did on San Juan Hill, even though it was the Battle of Kettle Hill. So kind of crazy to think about, but that's the way it works. Here's basically a military diagram set up of how the victories over the hill took place. The result, of course, is the Spanish are eventually forced to retreat, and then they're eventually forced to surrender. This is huge. So the Spanish actually get decimated on the Cuban coast. The Spanish, there's not much left of the Spanish forces on the Cuban coast. This means America is going to once again win. Of course, this is not the only area we're after. We also want Puerto Rico. And so on July 25th, 1898, we're going to invade Puerto Rico, another Spanish colony. This is the battle plan. We're going to land at the Port de Ponce, and then from there we're going to move our way inward. We're going to move inward to the rest of the island in battles that will take about 3 weeks to fight before the Americans will win. On October 18th, 1898, proudly, the United States raises the flag over San Juan, the capital of Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico is no longer a possession of the Spanish. They're no longer Spanish territory. Now they're under the control of the United States. Of course, Puerto Rico doesn't become a state, but at least for the time being, Puerto Rico is now safely in the hands of the United States. So the results of the war. So what's the outcome of the Spanish-American War? Well, there's a lot of people who died. 400 Americans to be exact, but that's nothing compared to the number of people who died because of disease. 2,100 people died because of disease. So most of the people don't actually die from battle wounds, from being shot or anything like that. They die from infection or getting malaria or some other kind of illness as part of the battle. So I always think that's kind of interesting to look at. As a result of the Treaty of Paris signed on December 10th, 1898, the United States will gain a ton of territory. We will gain control of the island of Guam. We will gain control over Puerto Rico. We will gain control over most of the West Indies. And then we'll talk about what happens to the rest of the territory, like the Philippines and Cuba, in a minute. As for what happens to Cuba, Cuba becomes an independent nation, but they're not really going to be truly independent. We'll talk about that in a second. And the United States actually agrees to purchase the Philippines. They don't actually, even though we won the war, we don't take them over. We actually give Spain $20 million to purchase the Philippines, so that's part of the treaty we sign. All said and done, after the Spanish-American War, the United States will add over 10 million people to the American population in over 100,000 miles of territory. So places like Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and then of course we've taken over Alaska, Hawaii, Midway. We've already talked about those. So this is a huge, huge expansion of the American empire. Now, question for you. How does the Treaty of Paris relate to the Monroe Doctrine? Well, remember the Monroe Doctrine, 1823, says that the United States has sole control over the Western Hemisphere. And so if we look at the Treaty of Paris, basically it's saying Cuba, Puerto Rico, many other islands in the Caribbean, all under the control of the United States. Another sort of outcome of the Spanish-American War is it really helps unite America after the Civil War. After the Civil War, even though that happens in 1865, America is still very much divided. The North doesn't really care for the South doesn't really care for the North. There's still a lot of hostility and animosity until the North and the South can join together and fight as a group against the Spanish. So it gives us somebody to fight against. And so sometimes by strengthening the power of the United States, we also see strengthening of cultural bonds. In class, we're going to watch a video called The Crucible of Empire. We'll watch parts about the Spanish-American War. We'll get to that later. But for now, that's the end. Until we talk about more of the results of the Spanish-American War, because when we talk about America as a world power and when we talk about some of the other results of what's going on in the time period, we'll see that America will continue to expand their influence. But for now, have a wonderful day.